Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Youth and Adult Pathways webinar on using data for continuous improvement. This is the 5th event in the YAP microgroup series. My name is Andy Simpson. I'm with the Manhattan Strategy Group, and I have with me today David Bernstein and John Burkhardt, both Senior Study Directors at Westat in Rockville, Maryland, and they're both experts in the field. So with that very brief introduction, I'll turn the floor over to David and John for self-introductions and to continue the presentation.
Hi everybody, this is David Bernstein speaking.
And this is John Burkhardt. Welcome all.
We'll get started right away. Westat, for those of you that did not have a chance to read the brief biographies that were on your Youth and Adult Pathways website, Westat is a social science research firm that's employee-owned in Washington, D.C., and we do a lot of work in the field of performance measurement and monitoring, evaluation, and performance for continuous improvement, which is why we were asked to speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. He's going to describe a little bit about what we'll be discussing today, and then we'll proceed from there.
Here's for the next slide. Okay, whoops. All right. We'll go to our introduction. Let's go back to the presentation outline, David. If you can do that, there we are. These are the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. In terms of the real substance, we're going to look at measurement, monitoring, and management, the 3 M's of performance. We want to talk about logic, models, and evaluation. Gathering information, how to do it, what to do, what to look out for. Good performance measures and management. What are the best practices and what should you be striving to do? Continuous improvement models, the reason for getting this information and for gathering it is to make improvements as you go along. We're going to take questions and answers at the end and provide you with our contact information so that you can get back to us if you've got questions after this session. We're going to be introducing concepts about data. Again, how to collect it, how to use it, looking at the basic concepts of performance measurement and management, continuous improvement, and evaluation. We're looking at this in terms of all publicly funded programs. These principles could apply in a whole variety of settings, but in particular for educational and nonprofit settings. It's not rocket science, but it is important to do the kinds of things that we're talking about in a rigorous and step-by-step manner. So, continuous improvement, measurable data, and there are several key topics here. First of all, it has to be measurable in one way or another. Systematically captured, and there needs to be some sort of process, and it's best to have this written down. Frequent and routine updates, that is the way to say how are things changing, and if you've done it for long enough, you may even be able to get into some of the why they're changing. Reproducible means that somebody else can use the same processes to gather the information and get the same information that you're getting. So if you have some interesting numbers and people say, well, how'd you get those? And you can't tell them, that's a key for a lookout, you know. So number 3, comparable to earlier data collection within your organization. It's great to to be able to start with a historical benchmark. Where were you? What was happening before you made some changes? You can look at what other organizations are doing in terms of their best practices. You may find it's more useful to look within your own organization if you're already satisfied that you're doing pretty well in terms of what others are doing. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to David for the performance 3 M's.
Hi everybody, this is David speaking. We're going to cover some definitional distinctions. Now, you can almost always find different definitions than the ones we're using. These have worked fairly well for us for the last 15 years or so. It's really not so much about the definitions, but the distinctions that will come up between some of the terms we're using. I just want to make sure that we're all somewhat on the same page together. So let's talk about performance measurement. It's a term that you've probably heard an awful lot. There's been a lot of emphasis on performance measurement and measuring performance and monitoring performance, particularly for the last 15 years or so. This is actually a very old field, and it goes back to the 1920s and 30s and some of the early efforts to document what government was doing in a rigorous and valid way so that citizens would have access to that kind of information. You sometimes hear people talk about it as being sort of episodic. It comes and it goes, almost like it's a trend, but the field itself has actually been there for quite some time, and then it comes around then again in a pretty regular basis. Performance measurement itself is a pretty inclusive term that refers to the routine measurement of program inputs, outputs, intermediate outcomes, or end outcomes. We're going to talk a little bit about those terms in a bit. The term I want to emphasize right here is routine measurement. Routine means we do it as a matter of course within the program and given the work that we are doing. Routine means that we try to do it in a consistent manner, so when we want to compare our data, we have the ability to do so. One of the ways that we support that process is by actually having a performance measurement system. This would be a process for collecting and reporting on program operations and results on a fairly regular basis. Let's talk a little bit about performance measurement use. So we sort of defined what performance measurement is. Performance measurement use is actually doing something with the data we're collecting. There are some folks out there who believe just the process of collecting the data is enough, but it really isn't. If you want to work towards continuous improvement, you have to find a way to collect, analyze, monitor, report, and then incorporate performance measures in a couple of different ways. First, facilitating resource allocation, making decisions about where we spend our money. General decision making. Is our program going the way that we really want it to? Should we consider some alternative ways to go? Program monitoring and management. This is sort of the routine thing that most managers do. In fact, a lot of times when we talk to program managers, we say, you know, tell us a little bit about how you use data. Oh, I don't use data. And they said, well, if they're in vehicle repair, we say, well, do you keep track of the number of vehicles that you handle in a day and how long it takes to repair those vehicles? And they go, yeah, actually we do that. I said, well, guess what? You're using performance measurement data. They just didn't know it was called that. Now finally, and this is the one that typically gets a lot of the visibility, is accountability and reporting. That means collecting the data and then making it available to either the public or to people within a management structure, within an organization, to elected bodies if these are public programs. It doesn't always mean that the people that are reading those reports use the data. It does mean that we're making it available if somebody wants to see it. Let's talk a little bit about performance monitoring. Okay, so let's say we've now collected the data so that we have it available to use. If we're collecting the data on a regular basis, whether it's weekly, monthly, it really depends on what the needs of the organization are. Then we can do some performance monitoring, which means periodically measuring a program's outputs and perhaps the quality of the service delivered, including things like program costs and activities that result in the outcomes we're trying to achieve. Now, it gets a little bit tricky because if you want to try to attribute the results you're seeing directly back to the program and not to something else, it gets a little tricky, and that's where you sort of start to creep into the area of evaluation or program evaluation, which is another term that you probably heard. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail when we talk about logic models, and we'll explain why we're going to talk about program evaluation once we start to look at some logic models and see how they're used. Performance management, like performance monitoring, is what we do with the information when we get it. If an organization routinely and continuously uses collected data, such as performance measures, and maybe some contextual information, and maybe some survey data, to drive strategic and performance planning, decision-making, resource allocation, and evaluation activities, then we would say that they are operating in a performance monitoring way. They're actually actively monitoring the performance of a program. Let's talk a little bit about performance management. Next slide, please. There we go. Performance management is the routine and continuous use of collected data. So we talked about some of the episodic uses, such as making decisions or for accountability. But if we really want to use data for continuous improvement, there are two things that have to happen. One, you have to have data that's updated relatively continuously. Now, in most programs, data gets reported on either monthly or quarterly, perhaps, but the actual process of collecting that data would be something that would occur rather regularly on an ongoing basis, and the data would then be passed up the line. And we want to have that regular data management in place to support all of these processes you see on the screen, the strategic and performance planning, decision-making, resource allocation, and evaluation activities. If decisions get made based on policies without looking at data, then we really don't have performance management. We have policy-driven decision-making. If instead we actually have performance measures and other data available and updated continuously, then we get into a performance management framework where the organization is being managed using data that is readily available, and readily available to more than just the decision makers, but pretty much to everybody within an organization. Next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about some of the data collection decisions that might have to be made. You can't manage with data, you can't continuously improve using data unless you've actually collected that data. So data collection systems really need to be in place from the beginning. If you've got a new program, you almost need to decide up front what kind of data are we going to need and how are we going to use it. What data will be collected at which points in time is something you need to consider. Who's going to collect the data? This is unbelievably important because many people think, performance measurement data, I don't do data, I do this, I do that. Particularly those of you that are in the instruction world, you know that you're constantly being asked to collect data about your programs and how your students are doing. Well, that process of collecting that data, doing it routinely, doing it consistently, no matter what, is really very important to having a good performance management system. Does the data capture what is needed for monitoring and reporting? You actually have to look back every once in a while and say, do we have the right measures in place? And then finally, deciding how will the data be used. Next, there's our next slide. Now, you may have heard these terms quite a bit, and it almost always creates confusion. So people like John and I like to tell people, we're translators. Don't worry about the terminology. We'll translate for you. We'll make it work within your organizational framework. But the basics of the types of performance measures that most organizations collect are inputs, which are the resources that would be used to provide a program or service, activities, which is descriptions using data of the services that are being provided, outputs, and that's the easy thing to measure. That's things like the number of students being served, the number of courses being offered, that sort of thing. These are measures of quantity of services provided or the quantity of a service that meets a certain quality requirement. Outcomes. This is the term that's getting all the buzz. What is a program actually doing relative to what its intended goal was? What are the measures that address the short-term, intermediate, or long-term results of a program or process on conditions for receiving a service? Now, customer satisfaction, depending on the purpose of the program, customer satisfaction might be an output. It might be an activity. You're trying to measure the satisfaction of the people who are being served. Or it might even be an outcome, again, depending upon the focus of a program. If in a program goal statement you see things like, the purpose of this program is to produce high-quality data that meets the needs of our stakeholders, well, you have to ask the stakeholders whether or not the data is meeting their needs. That's a customer satisfaction measure. I've added one more here that often creates confusion, and that's impacts. Outcomes can be directly linked back to a program, and impact is what happens in a person's lives. Now, those of you in the education field know that the impact of a program, for instance, training a student and giving them the education and on-hands training that they need in order to have a career, you may not see those results for many years. And yet there's still pressure to link what the program is doing to some kind of an outcome. So perhaps you get the student to the next level of education or training, and then you would go back several years later and try to assess what impact did all of that have on that student's life. You may have heard the term logic model. This is one way in which we relate all of the types of performance measures and the activities, outputs, and outcomes that a program is doing. Last slide, please. This is a generic logic model. This is one that the W.K. Kellogg Foundation developed. And you can Google or otherwise search for W.K. Kellogg logic model, and you'll see something that looks very much like this. I'm not going to reiterate what the terminology is. I've given you some of those definitions. But what I want you to see is the part that's on the bottom. You'll see that the program linked to this generic logic model should have a strategic goal, and then a couple of objectives by which you would measure whether that goal is being achieved. In order to do that, you have to have performance measures in place, and typically most programs would want performance goals or targets in place. How will you know you're continuously improving if you don't set some goals for yourself, some targets, and look at historical data to determine what's happening in the program? That's really what this process is doing. It's taking a logic model and applying it in a continuous performance improvement framework. Here's another version of our generic program outcome model. First, the inputs, what resources are being used, and typically it's money, number of staff, staff time, and number of volunteers, and perhaps volunteer time. What are the activities? What is the program seeking to do? And believe it or not, a lot of our hard work that John and I do is trying to define what is the activity that's actually being put in place. How is that activity different from what you perhaps have done in the past? What is it that that activity is intended to produce? What outputs or outcomes are intended to be in place? And you'll see some examples that we were nice. Judy Shanley, the coordinator for the YAP program, was nice enough to give us some of these examples. Activities would be things like instructional practices, program operations and management, and perhaps the alignment of national and state systems. The outputs are those things that are usually most easily countable. How many graduates do we have? How many courses do we have? What are the number of employer or business relationships? How long does it take for a student to complete? What's the rate of faculty and staff turnover? Because obviously turnover can affect your results. You'll want to know that. And, what are the number of professional development opportunities for faculty and staff? But ultimately, we don't exist to have the number of graduates or number of courses or programs. We exist to produce an outcome. What is the change in service, conditions, or processes that we would want to see? And that's what you see in that last column, the increase in the number of graduates employed, increases in student satisfaction, increases in fiscal efficiency. Here's one other logic model. This one is from the cooperative extension field. One of the reasons we included this is not to reiterate the inputs, outputs, and outcomes, because you've already seen that a couple of different ways. But we want to introduce a new concept here. That new concept is the assumptions that are being made about the program and what kind of results it will produce, and external factors that can affect the program. And you'll see down at the very bottom the term evaluation. We're going to be talking about evaluation for a minute or two. The reason this is important is performance measurement systems are very limited in terms of our ability to state why the changes that we're seeing are occurring. For that, there are typically assumptions in place and external factors that we need to understand better. That usually goes beyond the scope of what most performance management systems can handle and point to the need for more in-depth study, such as an evaluation. And we'll be talking about that in the next few slides. So what is an evaluation? An evaluation is a mechanism or system to objectively answer questions related to the goals and objectives of a program or function in a manner that is methodologically valid, scientifically reproducible. Somebody else could come in and produce the same results. It takes into account plausible alternative explanations for changes observed and can link those changes to the program or function. One thing I want to point out is the first two arrows, methodologically valid and scientifically reproducible, apply to both performance measurement and evaluation. You want rigorous methods. You want to be able to describe those methods to somebody else such that they could reproduce them and make it happen. You want to be rigorous. You want to collect data the same way all the time. That is true for both performance measurement as well as evaluation. Where evaluation differs, evaluation takes into account plausible alternative explanations for some of the changes that have been observed, and that allow you to then link those changes you've observed back to the program. That usually goes beyond the scope of what most performance measurement systems can do. So let's talk a bit about the similarities between performance measurement and evaluation. Both trace their roots back to the early days of the social sciences, and as I said, in the case of performance measurement, it actually precedes the development and maturity of many of the social sciences, which really occurred during World War II, the post-World War II era, and during Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, when evaluation as a field actually took off. Both performance measurement and evaluation contribute to accountability, providing information to monitor and report on programs, and to provide information on efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. And this is a very important point. If you're going to do an evaluation, those evaluations should incorporate routine performance measures as one source of data. I always remember back in the days when I was developing performance measures for a local government, and there was a lot of pushback about it, and people would say to me, why should we develop performance measures? I would say, well, wouldn't you like to evaluate your program and say whether it's working well? Well, the program staff a lot of times said, oh, maybe not so much, but the elected officials certainly did. If you don't collect data routinely via performance measurement systems, that data will not be available when it's time to do an evaluation after the program's been in place for a couple of years, and you want to see, is it really working? Can we attribute the results back to the activities of the program, or are there external factors at play. Let's talk about the differences. The differences really can be boiled down to this quote from Joe Holy, one of the leading evaluators of the last 40 years, particularly in the public sector. Evaluation can assess factors that influence performance, and that is beyond the scope of most performance measurement systems, because those systems are not comprehensive enough to eliminate those plausible alternative explanations. Now, we do the best job that we can to develop a performance measurement system. We use logic models to try to explain how we think the program's activities will result in the outputs and outcomes that we want to achieve. But when push comes to shove, it's really like looking at the gas tank meter on your dashboard. If you're driving along and you're used to getting 30 miles a gallon, you can reasonably expect how many miles you can go in the car before you start to see your gas gauge go down. If you suddenly saw that you were losing gas like crazy, and a trip that you normally could do on one tank of gas, you need to fill up 3 times, you might think there's something wrong with your car. Well, you've been monitoring one of the performance measures for your vehicle, the gas gauge. It's telling you how much gas you have, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you're using more gas than you're used to. We don't really know why. What you do is you get a mechanic to go under the hood and say, does my gas tank have a leak? Is there something wrong with my gas line? Why is my car not working the way it should? That is roughly the analogy between performance measurement and evaluation. Why is the program working well or not working well? You need an evaluation, a thorough evaluation, to be able to discover that. I'm now going to turn it over to John, who's going to talk a little bit about the kinds of information we need to gather to focus on stakeholder needs.
Sure. Thanks, David. Gathering information. There's lots of different kinds of information you can gather. We've talked about some program information and how you might gather it. Let's focus on consumers. And consumers could be students, they could be faculty, they could be administrators, they could be funders. If we can go back just a minute, one slide. Yeah. So how do you gather the information? And here's a list of ways to do it. Discuss with people involved. And again, you've got a wide range of people that might be involved. Open-ended inquiries. Just talk, ask, what do you think of when you think of this program? What do you think of when you think of educational needs? You can do needs assessments, and the needs assessment may involve secondary data like census information. They might involve literature reviews. Focus groups are groups, and they're generally small. We think that groups of 10 to 12 people are about the maximum that can be effectively used, and you have informal discussions, which are often recorded, sometimes videotaped, and you ask a set of questions, but you allow for a lot of open-ended responses. It's really good. I find it very useful to get transcripts of focus groups. Time of service feedback. Just after a program has been presented or a class has been conducted, you can ask people almost as they are walking out the door, or you can ask them to fill out cards, or you can ask them to call back in with kudos or complaints. Informal polls, and then surveys. And we're going to talk a lot about surveys, but presuming that everybody knows the difference between a survey and a census. The census is trying to get in contact with everybody who's involved. Survey is trying to get involved with a representative group of respondents. So, what about surveys? You have a whole number of questions that could be answered. The needs analysis. Ask people about their needs. Ask people about what kind of education they've had, what kind of information that they need, if they need additional degrees. You need to be a little careful with needs analysis and surveys. If somebody can figure out that they might be more likely to get a program that you might be offering, they're going to encourage you to offer the program. And they might or might not attend. But you need to be careful with needs analysis because people will always want the option of getting something better. Customer satisfaction. This is after individuals have been involved in a program. Did they like the teachers? Did they like the tests? Did they like the information that was received? And then service providers. Service providers like faculty, like administrators. What did they do, and did they think that the improvements were working for the service recipients? So we're going to talk about how survey results can be used in a number of different ways. Let's see, we go up 1 through 9. Number 1, verify effective and less effective practices. Whoops, we skipped. Okay, yeah, you'll find that there are some ways that work better than others, and you may not know until you actually ask people. Sometimes they do surprise us. Determine areas of strength and weakness. This may be in terms of some of the presenters for your program. It may be in terms of some of the products that you're working with. It may be in terms of some of the technologies you're working with, which are working, which are not working. These need to be looked at over different years, and so you can do surveys and as similarly as possible, please, over 2 years, 3 years, and look for trends and track changes in perceptions. Number 4, open-ended questions are really valuable in many ways. They're harder to code for the people who are tabulating the surveys, but oops, we need to go back again. But you can look for additional questions and for next time around. So if you keep the core of the survey the same, you may be able to drill down into things that are more and more specific in previous times. Which areas may need more rigorous examination? This will be part of the drilling down process and part of the analytical process that you will want to use. The game plan to celebrate effective elements, let people know about it. Let people know about your successes, and then develop strategies to address the less effective elements, which might include dropping some of the less effective elements. It might also include enhancing them in one way or another. Number 7, use survey results to establish and continue dialogues with stakeholders. Stakeholders are your friends, the people who are really committed to the program, the people who are really committed to the success of what you're trying to do. Look for linkages with other stakeholders. Look for their perceptions of success, their areas of concerns. Share your results and see what kind of feedback that they can give to you. And then use the surveys in conjunction with other information, other discussions, other focus groups, other ways of assessing complaints and kudos to provide examples for trends seen on the surveys. And all of this together will give you a strong analytical package that, as David has said, you can replicate time and again to track your trends over time. So David, tell us how this works in good performance management.
Just as a transition, thank you, John. One of the things I wanted to say earlier is that a lot of survey information is very useful for collecting what we would call contextual information. You know, the environment in which you're offering a program, the local conditions, the types of students that you're going to be dealing with, that's all contextual. And we, just as an industry, the whole measurement and evaluation industry really needs to get a better handle on the whole process of understanding context. It's a major issue in the field of evaluation, and one of our recent professional conferences a few years ago actually focused on the importance of context.
So David, while you're mentioning that, one of the things we ought to say is that surveys can really give you some fabulous quotes, which will bring it down to the personal level that policymakers often like to concentrate on, as well as the hard data.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Let's talk a little bit about good performance measures, whether those measures are being produced from surveys or from other routine data collections. First of all, you want them to be clear, understandable measures. Please, please, please try to avoid jargon, professional jargon, abbreviations, acronyms. You want your measures to be understandable by grandma. Just think of it that way. I always try to aim for having measures that a layperson could understand. Like we said, it's not rocket science, but it does require some work to have measures that are both accurate but also understandable. You want your measures to focus on results. I can promise you that the decision makers with whom you're working want to know not just how many students you're serving, because they understand how busy you are, but they will want to know, are you producing the kinds of results that the program and the decision makers and you as people involved in the field would like to see. So back to using the data. Data only gets used if it's relevant and useful to the stakeholders. So you want to try to make sure that as you're developing performance measures, you actually consult with stakeholders in the process to say, what kind of data would be useful to you and how would you want to use it? Valid, verifiable, and accurate. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This is sort of the science of performance measurement. We want to make sure that the information that we're collecting represents what we think it's supposed to collect, that somebody could come in and independently verify it, and that it's accurate. You don't want to be making decisions based on false information. You want the information to be accessible, measurable, and comparable. Now, the question that oftentimes comes up is, what about qualitative data? What about things like quotes, interview results, things that people are saying? Almost all good qualitative data analysis at some point gets quantitative, because while there might be one good quote, as John indicated, from a survey, what you really want to know is, what did the preponderance of people have to say about the program? So even if you're looking at open-ended comments about a program, you're at some point going to end up wanting to do some counting. Are most people positive in their comments? Are most people negative? Did people identify changes? And then try to quantify that. You can actually make open-ended qualitative data into a useful performance measure, but really only if you can count it in some way through some rigorous analytic process. As I've said, you want to involve the stakeholders, and in particular, you want to align your performance measures with the mission, goals, and objectives. How else will you know, as you're monitoring your program for continuous improvement, how else will you know that you're reaching your goals and objectives if you haven't aligned your measures to those goals and objectives? You'd be surprised how many good programs don't have a mission or goal statement, so that you have no idea what it is that the program's trying to get done. And then finally, you want to create a climate to support continuous improvement. That means giving people access to data. And we're going to give some examples of continuous improvement models And the key in almost all of these is the access to the data that is needed. Before we go there, just very quickly about good performance management, not just having good data, but connecting the use of data to the planning, budgeting, and decision-making process, using data to inform policy debates, assisting in coordination of support systems, and basically making the data available to everyone, as I said, and then incorporating evaluation to assess more complex issues that go beyond the performance measurement system. Now we're going to give a couple of examples. This first example is rather well known. You may have heard of the Balanced Scorecard. The Balanced Scorecard was developed and published in the Harvard Business Review back in 1992, and it became a very popular approach to doing performance measurement, in that it went beyond the typical bottom line in the business sector to focus on the financial perspective, the internal business perspective, how are we managing our work, the growth and learning perspective, how can we support employees in learning and growing. That gets back to the professional development we talked about as an outcome for some of your programs, and then a customer perspective. A couple of very brave local governments tried to apply the Balanced Scorecard and found that there was a piece missing. So Kaplan and Norton went back and said, what is the missing piece? And the missing piece was really the public benefit. That is the bottom line of most publicly funded programs. So the model that you're seeing here is the original Kaplan and Norton model. If you get onto the internet and do a search for Balanced Scorecard for the public sector, including education programs, you will see a slightly different version of the model that incorporates the public benefit of programs as well. Speaking of public programs, this is one of my favorites, mostly because I got to know this program very well. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, Prince William County, Virginia is south of the Washington Beltway on Route 95. And many, many years ago, the folks in Prince William County developed a performance model that involved continuous improvement, including strategic planning, which you see in the oval at the top of the page, and then a program planning process of setting goals, objectives, and measures. You may remember in the last slide we had on good performance management, we emphasized the setting of goals and objectives so you know what you're trying to achieve. Then you'll see floating off in space the linking resources to outcomes. This is the budget process that they do in Prince William County, Virginia. And then they use the budget process and service levels to make decisions and set targets about how programs will operate given the level of resources that are available. Those services then get delivered. That's roughly analogous to the activity section of the logic models. And you'll see, again, floating out in space, learning and service efficiency improvements. That learning process is using performance measures to find out how programs are working. And here's how they do that in Prince William County in the upper left-hand corner. They regularly update their plans by talking to the community and asking the community what they think of their programs. They evaluate results for programs. They do citizen surveys. They do citizen input. This is analogous to the stakeholder surveys that John was talking about. They do performance reporting, so both the public as well as elected officials and program staff and managers have access to the information, and then if those performance measures bring up issues that something's happening in the program, it triggers a process of evaluation. Now what I want you to see is that last arrow, about 11 o'clock on that chart. It leads right back to the strategic planning process. In Prince William County, their model involved a feedback mechanism, and the process would start all over again. That's what makes Prince William County's model a continuous improvement model. Here's another rather well-known example of a continuous improvement model that you may have heard of. Back in 1993, Congress passed and President Clinton signed the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. It has since been modernized. in recent years. But right now, I just want to focus on this particular continuous improvement model. What you'll see is a similar process to the one that they use in Prince William County. Number one, they define mission and desired outcomes, and they do that for every major federal program. And even under the new modernized GEPRA, there is still a process of defining missions, desired outcomes, and setting high priority objectives. Performance is then regularly managed and monitored. And one of the results of that is the use of performance information to make decisions. Now, one thing that you will see that's missing from this is the evaluation process. And one of the things that made GEPRA, GPRA, unique was that it actually linked performance and measurement and monitoring to evaluation, with the realization that performance measures themselves were not enough to really define whether a large government program was working well or not. Federal government programs are way too complex and way too large to make decisions about just on the basis of performance measures. So what you see missing here is one of the uses of performance information is for the federal government, Congress, and the executive branch to decide where evaluations might be needed. This is a rough model of what a program improvement process looks like. This, too, is another continuous improvement process, kind of a generic one for programs. You'll see it starts by analyzing existing conditions. Roughly speaking, that's establishing a baseline against which results will be compared, and then determining the needs and resources that will be needed. Then the program would define community goals, objectives, and evaluation strategies, and should include all stakeholders. Now, do we always include all stakeholders? Probably not. But in the ideal, you would include all significant stakeholders in that process. It's the ethically right thing to do in developing programs, is to involve people that are affected by those programs. You would confirm working relationships. Who's going to do what? You would design and assess alternative services and strategies. You would implement the service changes that you want, and then you would monitor that performance and evaluate and improve the service, and you'll see the feedback loop back up to analyzing existing conditions. So in the end, what do we really mean by measuring success? Well, did the program plan do what it was supposed to? What did the program do? What activities were undertaken? What was produced as a result of the program activities? What happened as a result of producing those outputs? And in the long term, how did lives change as a result of the program? What are the impacts of the program? I'm now going to turn it over to John, and he'll wrap up the presentation part of the webinar, and we'll get ready to take some questions if anybody has any.
Just one final caution. There may be lions and tigers, oh my. Sometimes they're out of the immediate viewpoint. So be careful. You may have to adjust as you go along. And finally, here's how you get in contact with us, with David and myself, and we'd be happy to take questions now or after the program.
If you do have questions, just put those in the question box on the control panel for the webinar. You can do that now, and we'll read the question aloud and answer.
We hope we didn't leave you too speechless. We know it was a lot of information in a short time, and that's why we'll let it sink in. And from what I understand, the PowerPoint presentation will be made available after the fact in an archival form.
Yes, it will, and Shia Brown just asked that same question. We will make this presentation available as an archived recording on the LINCS website at lincs.ed.gov, and you'll go to the YAP microgroup to find that materials. We should have those posted within about 7 to 10 days. We need to get those transcribed for accessibility compliance. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in at this time. We'll give it about another 5 or 10 seconds here. Okay, we do have another question from Karen Martinson. Do blank templates exist for these models so we can just fill in the blanks? David or John, do you want to take this?
Don't we wish? You know what?
Wouldn't that be nice?
Wouldn't that be nice? You know, there probably are models out there, particularly the logic models. That W.K. Kellogg model is a great place to start because it really defines what are the things that we're conducting the program with. That's the inputs. What are the activities being conducted? What will we produce? And those are usually quantitative measures of results. And then what conditions are going to change as a result? That is sort of a generic model that could be used on an ongoing basis. The balanced scorecard is a generic model that many organizations have used and developed what they call dashboards. They're data dashboards. They're ways of regular reporting data both to management and to people within the organization who have need for the data in order to make informed decisions. And you can find some models for the balanced scorecard. Of course, there are a lot of consultants out there that would like to charge you a lot of money to customize the balanced scorecard to your particular organization. There's trainings that you can take on how to go about doing this. I think if you simply search in the area of logic models, continuous improvement, you will see that there's some models out there that you could emulate. This stuff is not exactly boilerplate in that you can just put it in place and expect it to just roll out. You do need to have a very thorough understanding of what you're trying to achieve with your programs, and a lot of that comes from those discussions between the people that design the program, that put the program in place, between program managers and staff and stakeholders, and getting everyone involved in the process of understanding what the program's supposed to do, how it works, and you more than templates, you can find case study models out there of how this sort of an approach would work. And I'd probably just encourage you to do a little bit of research on the net to find that sort of thing.
And do talk to your peers. They probably have the same kind of questions about the effectiveness of their programs as you have about your programs. And they may have set this up. They may have data collection instruments. They may have analytical models, or they may not. But the process of talking to them should give you a better picture of what it is you need to do.
Two other resources that I want to bring to your attention. One of them is the Baldrige process. Malcolm Baldrige was a Secretary of Commerce, and under his stead and in his name there is a process called the Baldrige process, which involves the continuous use of data for the improvement of programs. And the process has actually evolved to the point that the National Institutes of Standards and Technology provides awards to people in the name of Baldrige for having good programs that involve continuous use of data. So I would encourage you to Google BALDRI
Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Youth and Adult Pathways webinar on using data for continuous improvement. This is the 5th event in the YAP microgroup series. My name is Andy Simpson. I'm with the Manhattan Strategy Group, and I have with me today David Bernstein and John Burkhardt, both Senior Study Directors at Westat in Rockville, Maryland, and they're both experts in the field. So with that very brief introduction, I'll turn the floor over to David and John for self-introductions and to continue the presentation.
Hi, everybody. This is David Bernstein speaking.
And this is John Burkhardt. Welcome all.
We'll get started right away. Westat, for those of you that did not have a chance to read the brief biographies that were on your Youth and Adult Pathways website, Westat is a social science research firm that's employee-owned in Washington, D.C., and we do a lot of work in the field of performance measurement and monitoring, evaluation, and performance for continuous improvement, which is why we were asked to speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to John. He's going to describe a little bit about what we'll be discussing today, and then we'll proceed from there.
Here's for the next slide. Okay, whoops. All right. We'll go to our introduction. Let's go back to the presentation outline, David. If you can, there we are. These are the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. In terms of the real substance, we're going to look at measurement, monitoring, and management, the 3 M's of performance. We want to talk about logic, models, and evaluation. Gathering information, how to do it, what to do, what to look out for. Good performance measures and management. What are the best practices and what should you be striving to do? Continuous improvement models, the reason for getting this information and for gathering it is to make improvements as you go along. We're going to take questions and answers at the end and provide you with our contact information so that you can get back to us if you've got questions after this session. We're going to be introducing concepts about data. Again, how to collect it, how to use it, looking at the basic concepts of performance measurement and management, continuous improvement, and evaluation. We're looking at this in terms of all publicly funded programs. These principles could apply in a whole variety of settings, but in particular for educational and nonprofit settings. It's not rocket science. But it is important to do the kinds of things that we're talking about in a rigorous and step-by-step manner. So, continuous improvement, measurable data, and there are several key topics here. First of all, it has to be measurable in one way or another. Systematically captured, and there needs to be some sort of process, and it's best to have this written down. Frequent and routine updates, that is the way to say how are things changing, and if you've done it for long enough, you may even be able to get into some of the why they're changing. Reproducible means that somebody else can use the same processes to gather the information and get the same information that you're getting. So if you have some interesting numbers and people say, well, how'd you get those? And you can't tell them